Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on your time zone. My name is Chiraj Bajpayee. I am the Senior Research Fellow for South Asia at Chatham House. So thank you for joining us today for this Chatham House and Japan House event on the CPTPP and the economic order in the Indo-Pacific. This is the second of three events which we are holding in partnership with Japan House London. You can watch the previous event on Southeast Asia and the US-China relationship on our website. And we can probably share that link in the event chat. So this event will be on the record and it will be posted on the Chatham House website. So just to set the scene, what is now known as the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is quite a mouthful, has been framed as a gold standard free trade agreement, given its emphasis on labor and environmental standards, digital trade, and anti-corruption safeguards. It's undergone numerous transformations. It began as the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, before the U.S. withdrew from the agreement in 2017. Japan then assumed the reins of leadership, and the UK will become the trade initiative's 12th member once the ratification process is completed. And just last month, Singapore became the second country to ratify the UK's accession to the CPTPP. So focusing on the policies of these three key countries, the US, Japan, and the UK, we have an excellent panel of speakers joining us today. Joining us from the US is Ms. Wendy Cutler. Ms. Cutler is Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. And prior to this, she had a 3-decade career in the Office of the US Trade Representative. Also joining us from the US is Ms. Shihoko Goto. She is Director of the Geo-Economics and also Director of the Asia Program at the Wilson Center. And last but not least, we have Dr. Minako Morita Jaeger. She is Senior Research Fellow in International Trade at the University of Sussex Business School. She's also a Policy Research Fellow at the UK Trade Policy Observatory and a researcher at the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy. So each of the speakers will make opening remarks for about 5 minutes before we then open up for discussion. Feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box over the course of the event, and I'll direct your question to the relevant panelist on your behalf. So let's get started then with Wendy Cutler, who will begin by presenting the US position on the CPTPP. Wendy, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's really my honor to be on such a panel with such distinguished guests. I mean, at one point, the US, we were part of the TPP, so we had a real place in a discussion like this. But now we're on the outside. And so I really look forward to hearing from my colleagues about what's really going on inside the room. I don't have any kind of good news to share with respect to the prospects of the United States rejoining the CPTPP. I never say never, but I think the prospects are really slim, remote for the foreseeable future. And why do I say this? Well, two words kind of explain it: domestic politics. But in my few minutes, let me just delve a little deeper into that. First of all, I would just say that if you look at our presidential campaign now between Biden and Trump, the two likely candidates, CPTPP is nowhere near their radar screen. Trump pulled the United States out of TPP, and he was very happy about that. Although I understand that at certain moments in his presidency, he did question the merits of such a quick and early move. Second, the Biden administration has really put trade policy to the sidelines, being very responsive to the demands and interest of the working class, of the middle class, and of the progressive wing of the party. And so, again, this isn't even on the radar screen for for the foreseeable future for us. Second, there's no real strong advocacy from Congress, from stakeholders, and others who presumably in our democracy could help shift public opinion when I speak privately to people in Congress, or when you see things released by the business community, yeah, people say we made a huge mistake leaving. We should get back in, but the passion isn't there anymore. And I think that given how modest our overall trade agenda is, people in response have a much more modest ambition. And so you'll hear, we can talk more about this, but you'll hear people in the United States talk about the prospects maybe of a few bilateral FTAs, or maybe doing more work on IPEF. But the notion of a big mega, regional trade deal with comprehensive market access commitments just doesn't seem to be on the radar screen, or anything that anyone is seriously pushing now. Third, I would just say that even if we were to entertain the possibility of returning, the current CPTPP is out of date. It would need serious revisions. I understand that members of CPTPP in San Francisco a few months ago launched a review of the provisions of the agreement with the view of updating the agreement. But I would just conclude on the note and say that at the Asia Society, we did author a paper, a bipartisan paper, with my Republican colleague, Cleet Willems, where we put forward kind of 12 areas of updates, improvements, adjustments that countries would need to consider if indeed, folks were interested in us returning. Some of those are taken from the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement. Other ideas are taken from IPEF, but again, and other sources. But I would just, put on the table that the agreement is old right now and it needs to be updated. I think new issues need to be addressed in the CPTPP, but also some provisions that are in the current text, like ISDS, for example, I think would be non-starters in the United States, given the political climate. So let me stop there.
Thank you for that, Wendy. That's excellent. So you've made it abundantly clear that we're unlikely to see the U.S. Rejoin the CPTPP anytime soon. But building on what you just said, I mean, could you foresee sort of the U.S. at some point in the far future rejoining the CPTPP, is if it's reformed in a similar way to the way NAFTA was reborn as the US MCA. So if we see updated provisions on areas like digital trade or intellectual property, or new sections on supply chains or economic coercion, could you at some point foresee, sort of the US re-embracing the CPTPP?
Well, that's certainly, it would be a positive development, but I just wonder at this point in the United States if just the baggage of the name TPP is just too much for the American public and the American political community to embrace. I would just say, if you look at the USMCA, about 60–70% of it just lifted from the CPTPP. So when I look to the future, and I think when we're ready to do something more comprehensive, or with many, other countries in the region, it may look like parts of CPTPP, but I think we would really need to rebrand it domestically for it to have any chance of going forward.
Okay, great. So on that note, let's turn to Japan's position on the CPTPP with Shioko Goto. Shioko, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me here today. So I've been tasked with talking about Japan's position regarding the CPTPP. And Tejas, you said in your opening statement that Japan has played a key role in keeping the CPTPP together and allowing it to flourish since the US exodus in 2017. I do want to point out, though, that Japan was actually the last country to join as one of the original members of the TPP in 2013. And we should not forget that when Japan was deliberating on whether to join the TPP or not, there was considerable domestic opposition. But at that time, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, in announcing Japan's entry, argued that this was, quote, the last chance for Japan to have this opportunity to be part of the rulemaking in the world. So for Japan, CPTPP and its predecessor TPP has been, of course, first and foremost, a trade deal, but it's also been a foreign policy vision as well. And CPTPP has really been able to elevate Japan's standing as a diplomatic as much as an economic power. And I want to point out 3 points why CPTPP is an integral part of Japan's foreign policy as much as it is a trade policy. So the first point is that it is a trade deal that has a broader vision to secure Japan's geostrategic interests. And it's interesting to note that when the United States left in 2017, there was considerable worry about in Tokyo about any potential backlash from Washington for Japan to continue keeping the TPP intact even without the United States. It was able to do so. There was no negative response from the United States, but that Tokyo has always been very mindful of the US response to to its economic leadership, and I do want to point that out. The second point I want to make is that Japan has been a leader in committing not just Japan, but to the world to trade deals and to having strong interconnected trade relations, even as the United States has retreated from multilateral and even minilateral trade deals. So even as the United States has really been reluctant to sign on to new deals, we've seen the rise of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with the 10 ASEAN countries, as well as 5 others, including Japan, Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand. Japan's had a bilateral with the EU, a bilateral with the UK as well. And it continues to argue for the United States to come back into the CPTPP fold. Japan has also played a critical part in ensuring that IPEF, the Indo-Pacific economic framework that Washington has instigated, has a well-rounded membership that reflects Southeast Asian countries as well, and not the more obvious US partners in the region. The third point I want to make is that Japan has now developed greater confidence, not only in its economic leadership, but also in its diplomatic and foreign policy leadership as well. And it is committed to securing the rule of law, including the commitment to transparency through trade deals within as well as beyond the Indo-Pacific. And as we know, Wendy has already talked about the CPTPP needing to be revised and revamped, but we do know that there is a tremendous role for CPTPP and the trade agenda to move forward. And I believe that the key to this, even though the United States is hesitant to signing on to new trade agreements, that doesn't mean that the United States is not interested in trade, nor that it doesn't have any trade interests. There are trade issues of strategic value for the United States, including supply chain resiliency. And so Japan's role moving forward will be to ensure to keep the United States engaged in issues of critical mutual importance when it comes to advancing new trade concerns between Japan and the United States and other, especially advanced economies. So let me stop there for now.
Thank you, Shihoko. So just building on the point you made about the CPTPP serving Japan's geostrategic interests, we saw last year during Japan's chairmanship of the G7 that the emergence of a new work stream, economic security. So I'm curious to know the extent to which this idea of economic security is also seeping into the CPTPP agenda.
Right. So it's interesting. Japan has really taken on a very comprehensive approach to economic growth. As I said, CPTPP has been part and parcel of a greater vision of Japan having and its free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Japan has also been at the forefront when it comes to really defining and promoting economic security. It is the first country that has appointed a minister, a cabinet level minister dedicated to economic security. It has gone through with legislation to ensure economic security. Now, from Japan's perspective, though, economic security is as much a domestic issue to ensure greater infrastructure resilience as it is about issues related directly to trade, such as supply chain resiliency and an ability to withstand against economic coercion. So I think this is where we have to think about what does CPTPP bring to the table, what's lacking, what are some of these more recent interests. And we haven't talked about this either, but this ability to push back against some of the coercive measures that China and other authoritarian regimes are taking. Is there an ability for that, a collective economic resistance to coercive action? These are some of the issues that perhaps go beyond the scope of traditional trade agreements, but nonetheless are high on the greater trade and economic cooperation agenda.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So finally, let's turn to the UK perspective of the CPTPP from Dr. Marita Jaeger. Over to you, Minako.
Thank you so much, TG. It's my great pleasure to be here today together with distinguished my panelists, Wendy and Shoko. I always was talking about the US perspective from the more domestic lens. This what will be the economic, the societal impact on the CPTPP. But today I try to think about what the UK can bring to the CPTPP from the international relations perspective, especially strategic perspective. I'd like to focus as my initial remark. I'd like to spotlight the three issues, three areas where the UK can contribute to the CPTPP. The first is the UK will become a key player for protecting the CPTPP's value on rule-based liberal order. The CPTPP stands on the norms of liberal and open trade, but the CPTPP is not purely unified. When we look at the level members, we see, the different levels of economic development, the political system, and the diverse cultural backgrounds. After the US left the TPP, the CPTPP became a de facto middle power club, surrounded by superpowers, the US, the EU, and China. The middle powers have to navigate through this today's politically, economically, and systemically volatile world, especially striking a balance between de-risking from China and coexisting with China is not an easy task, especially for middle powers. So they need collective actions together with allies that share political and economic norms. The UK is a free, open, liberal economy. The UK is one of the close allies for Japan, Australia, and Canada. And Canada, I must say, is a chair this year, the CPTPP chair this year. I observed that Japan was a strong supporter of the UK to bring the club, as Shihoko will mention, and likewise Australia and Canada highly welcome the UK to play a role in retaining the CPTPP's rules-based liberal order in the Indo-Pacific region. The UK fortified the CPTPP's value and strengthened the ties among like-minded countries within the CPTPP, together with its close allies, especially Japan, Australia, and Canada. The second thing is UK opened the horizon of the CPTPP beyond the Asia-Pacific and potentially the liberal trade model for global rules. The UK set its geostrategic ambition using the Indo-Pacific tilt narrative expressing its ambition of enhancing its political, economic, and then security relations with the regions in its Integrated Review 2021 and Integrated Review Refresh in 2023. Although the UK set the CPTPP as a policy framework to achieve its ambitions of this Indo-Pacific tilt, doing so created a precedent that a country outside Asia-Pacific can join the club as long as it can fulfill the requirements. The UK's accession has stimulated other non-Asia-Pacific countries to join the club, such as current applicants, Uruguay, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Ukraine. So this means the CPTPP has a potential to be extended to mega cross-regional framework. From the international trade policy perspective, I see the potential that the CPTPP rules could be used as a template of the multilateral rules. As the CPTPP successfully expands, it will provide a strong momentum of multilateralizing the CPTPP, such as the theme of the WTO. Third, the UK set a good precedent for future applications. So the UK's accession is very much in line with the CPTPP accession guideline. The UK shows a high level of market access, accepting rules with very limited side letters, the exception that is an ISDS, intellectual property, grace period. So the UK demonstrates that it respects the CPTPP's value of open and liberal trade order and rule-based trade. The UK set a high bar for joining the CPTPP, and what the CPTPP members always emphasize as a TAG, you said gold standard agreement, that indirectly indicated the CPTPP is not like the RCEP, which is more shallow rules, and then also including China. So this is really important, especially for China, the waiting for the application on the queue, the next one. And then lastly, I very quickly like to mention that the three challenges were how we can address the CPTPP members should address. The one is mainly I observed that main challenge is whether the CPTPP can maintain its value. As Shihoko and Wendy address, the economic security is one of them. That's the backbone of this issue is this narrative of this Indo-Pacific terminology. The Indo-Pacific terminology is used in geopolitical discourse from the 2010s, led by the US and its allies, mainly Japan and Australia. Indo-Pacific is a geostrategic term. It started from the mental mapping exercise and grew to political drivers, and it has now become the vision of the regional order, as IPEF shows. So it refers to the government's approach to security, diplomacy, and economics. The problem is that it is very vague. Its a precise definition, meaning, and implication not well understood even among CPTPP members. And the interpretation becomes very different depending on which country's lens we use, such as from the Japan's lens or the US lens, or Singaporean lens or Malaysian lens, and then China's lens. The key point here is a strategic approach that, this objective of the US and its allies of the political discourse is diluting China's influence. How we can cope with that? And then I will be happy to talk about more about China's accession later, but I stop here now.
Thank you, Minako. That was very helpful. And I can see questions already coming in, but please continue to submit your questions. Perhaps I could just ask you one question before we open up to everyone. We're likely to have elections in the UK later this year with the possibility of a change in government. So do you see any shift in priority under a future Labour government under a possible future Labour government towards the CPTPP, so within the broader context of its Indo-Pacific tilt, which you mentioned?
Thank you so much. This is very, very interesting, the question. We always have to remind that most, the important economic partner, trade partner for the UK is EU. So geostrategic, geographically and then historically, culturally, it will not change, even the UK is now outside the EU. And once the Labour Party became the ruling party in the UK, I think about the Labour Party will more, try to rebuild the relation with the EU, but it does not mean that they will just, ignore the CPTPP, and then I think that Labour Party will be fully aware of the, the importance of the Indo-Pacific area. But I must say that is also relating to the more, policy, domestic policy. That is the more societal concern, how to just address the societal concern. And then the CPTPP is not really the, so from the societal perspective, it does not reflect the, traditional UK's FTA model. And then there are kind of societal conflict after the UK successfully signed, joining the CPTPP, but many concerns such as ISDS and then also digital trade chapters, and these civil society concerns will be maybe more, stakeholder, whole inclusive stakeholder will be more, the Labour Party would more, pay attention to these non-economic concerns as well. I stop here.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you all for your opening remarks. So we've received plenty of questions, and maybe I'll start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is China. And this is a question that's been put forward by Rosemary Foote. So, where does this leave China's bid to join the CPTPP? So putting aside the, the sheer difficulties of China to fulfill the criteria of the CPTPP on such areas as intellectual property rights or subsidies or digital trade, but just given the growing emphasis that you've highlighted on working with so-called like-minded countries or trusted geographies, is this essentially a dead end for Beijing, or can you foresee any circumstances under which Beijing and which China could be admitted to the CPTPP? I don't know, Shihoko, would you like to go first on that, and maybe I'll turn to you then, Wendy.
I think the first question has to be, China applied first. Taiwan a week afterwards. So the question is, how can the members include both Taiwan and China, or can they actually simply accept China on its own? So these are kind of like the two options, or exclude both Taiwan and China. From the perspective of countries like Japan, the inclusion of China's accession is incredibly difficult, because what we do focus on is Taiwan's security. Taiwan is far more accession ready than China is, but from a geostrategic perspective, including Taiwan is imperative. But at the same time, we know that there are member countries within the CPTPP that would be vehemently opposed to having Taiwan included. And I give the example of IPEF, the US-led economic agreement. It's not a trade agreement per se. But even then, it was difficult to have an IPEF with Taiwan as a member country. And so the United States had to do a bilateral just with Taiwan. If the United States can't pull it off, how can the CPTPP member countries be able to include Taiwan into the fold without China? The China, if the goal, and I would say that one of the critical goals of Japanese foreign policy is to ensure the stability of Taiwan, and it cannot do so credibly without including Taiwan into CPTPP, and China cannot be part of this agreement. So I know Minako has opinions on this too, so let me turn it over to her.
Minako, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, China is really the kind of the game changer of the CPTPP's future expansion. And I must say, nobody knows the real intention of China applying the CPTPP. But I think that, well, there are several conjunctions. I think maybe I can say 4. The one is that its intention lies in blocking Taiwan becoming CPTPP member. The second is dividing CPTPP members. So CPTPP members do not have the same position regarding China's accession. And one is more China friendly, and then also the group which has strong concern on China, such as Japan, Australia, and Canada. And then they are very much cautious. And but I don't know about the New Zealand's position. So that is really the China trying to divide the CPTP members. And the third is blocking the UK's future accessions, potential accessions, and then coming back to the CPTPP. And the fourth is use the CPTPP accession as its domestic and world policy leverage for domestic reforms. As for the last thing, many critics said, well, that will be true, not be true. My case personally, I'm very much suspicious. But the insider of the China, they actually they're not unified. The China itself is not unified, and then there's some forces want to reform. That's really proceed the domestic reforms. But as the question is, the question is, when we look at from merely trade policy, terms, looking at the rules, the state enterprises, then digital trade chapters, and intellectual property right, competition policy, all of these, also labor rights, purely, it is so difficult for China to accept all of these rules. And even domestic reforms, seriously take it into account, it will take decades to reform in line with the CPTPP. So that before that, that my suggestion is, well, maybe the CPTPP members will start the more be positive will start in the China's the application, the accession process, and then we see what would happen. And then as far as I know, because I'm outside of the CPTPP, I'm not a diplomat, so I don't know that in detail, but the procedure of the multi-application is not yet established. So even China applied before Taiwan, does not mean that then Taiwan cannot, Taiwan's application cannot start. So that I think multi-application process and then purely, requirement, whether the China can fill the requirement or not, will be that's something that they have to do, not a politically, driven approach.
Thank you for that. I mean, the impression I get is that the China its reason for applying has more to do with it trying to be a potential spoiler to the CPTPP and undermine any efforts to marginalize China in the regional economic architecture, rather than a genuine desire for reform. At least that's the impression I'm getting. Would you? I guess that's what you're saying. Then Minako, that's and then let me just address, I guess, the second part of Rosemary's question, which is, well, essentially, going back to you, Minako, then will the UK's entry pave the way for further expansion? So we've just, several economies have expressed interest in joining. We've already mentioned Taiwan, but what about South Korea? I've also heard Costa Rica and other Latin American countries have expressed interest. I think in some ways it appears South Korea is the most likely. Well, what are your thoughts on?
Can I weigh in on
expansion?
China?
Yes, please. Yeah,
before we
go
get
ahead,
to others, because just a few points. I think it's fascinating that both China and Taiwan now, they applied over 2.5 years ago, if my math is correct. And, the CPTPP members have been pretty quiet on this. In their statements that have come out since then, they do, and I'm sure this is under Japan's leadership and Australia and others, every statement emphasizes the need for all accession partners to live up to the high standards, but also to have a track record of implementation. And I think that second phrase is so China focused because, as we've all seen, China, while it has is party to many trade agreements and trade arrangements, it doesn't have a great track record. And this mentioned earlier how economic coercive measures need to kind of, that whole issue needs to be addressed in the CPTPP. As China has implemented economic coercive measures, it has violated it's FTA with Australia, it's FTA with Korea. The US has had implementation problems with the phase 1 agreement with China. So I just want to put that on the table. The CPTP countries are so divided on this issue. And not only is the China accession complicated, but when you think about it, with the Taiwan accession, like mentioned earlier, it just becomes more complicated. So if you're really cynical and you think that, China applied to join the CPTPP for nefarious reasons, and one of them was to ensure that there'd be no way that Taiwan could become a member, then, you in some ways, China has won, even if their application goes nowhere. Because what I'm seeing is kind of that accession process with China and Taiwan is just, it's paralyzed. It's a paralyzed process now. And it's hard for me to see how that will be unlocked because of the Taiwan, if members are going to go ahead and say, sure, let's start the accession process with China, some will say, well, we need to do the same with Taiwan because the agreement could not be clearer that customs territories are eligible for accession to the agreement. So I put that on the table. And I would also just say that, I already opened up and said it's highly unlikely or, slim prospects the US and anytime soon will consider joining. But if China were to join, or if even the formal application process were to begin with China, that would be the kiss of death for any consideration of membership by the United States. For a country like Japan, they'd have to keep that seriously in mind if they were kind of somehow going to go ahead and allow some kind of loose accession process to begin. So I see things just increasingly paralyzed on this China-Taiwan front, and maybe that paves the way for your next question, which I'll weigh in later on the status of other accession candidates.
Thank you, Wendy. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So as you've said, I think China's accession is extremely unlikely. But if it were to happen, that would be a real game changer for the U.S. approach towards the Indo-Pacific. So putting aside China, Taiwan, and the U.S., who do we see next in line for potential accession to the CPTPP? As I said, it seems to me that South Korea is a very it's most likely candidate, but are there other countries that you see in the pipeline?
Well, I would just add South Korea is yet to, it hasn't formally applied to the CPTPP. My understanding is in addition to China and Taiwan, there are 4 other economies that have expressed interest, including Ukraine, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. I think the CPTPP partners are grappling with these accession applications because, if anything, what the UK accession process showed, this is a very resource-intensive negotiation for any accession partner. Now, granted, probably members spent more time with the UK because it was the first, and they wanted to demonstrate that they weren't going to make a lot of exceptions or give Britain a lot of breaks, because then that could be used by other accession partners. But again, that said, even if countries, let's say, were to start the process with Costa Rica, a smaller country, but probably of those 6, or at least of those 4, they seem probably from an economic trade point of view the most ready. Do CPTPP members want to spend a year of their time trying to get Costa Rica in? And I throw that out. I have nothing against Costa Rica, but it's something to consider. South Korea did formally express interest. I believe it was in 2013. And at that time, I was a US negotiator for TPP. And frankly, when they told us that they were ready now and wanted to join, we told them, you know what, too late. We're close to completion of this agreement, but we'll look at you as an accession candidate. I think the feeling was in 2013 was that we were going to conclude the negotiations within months. Didn't happen, but we'll get to that in a minute. And that bringing in a new partner would just delay the conclusion. I think if we had known that the negotiations would have, in hindsight, lasted 2 more years, we probably would have said fine to Korea, but that's water under the bridge. Korea since then has had a lot of fits and starts with respect to its interest in joining CPTPP, including during the lame duck period between President Moon and now President Yoon, when the progressive government in its final days was really trying to reach consensus domestically so Korea could put in a formal bid, but it never was able to cross that bridge. And in my discussions with Korea, this is just not a burning issue for them. I think if the US were to express interest in rejoining, they would be extremely interested. One of the main reasons they have not wanted to join since the US left is a fear that Japan would put undue request on them, having all the negotiating leverage. And, potentially with the improvement between relations between Japan and Korea, maybe these fears aren't as high as they used to be. But I also would think that Japan would have fears that if they started that process and if things politically changed in Korea, that could make it, for Korea, a more difficult negotiation as well. So I look, maybe Korea, but I'm not convinced that they're in any hurry. And that leaves me then to look to see if there are any other eligible and interested Southeast Asian countries, because I think there'd be a lot more interest among the CPTPP membership in trying to encourage the accession of some Southeast Asian countries, whether it be Thailand that has expressed interest in the past, Indonesia, or others.
Thank you for that, Wendy. Minako, what about the European Union? So given that we don't see any prospect of a transatlantic FTA TTIP being revived anytime soon, do you see potential for the EU to join the CP or apply to join the CPTPP or any European countries apart from the UK?
This is very, the very interesting question. I know there, papers and then inside the EU, then the research institute, the think tank, and they wrote more, the sort of Indo-Pacific tilt approach of the as a EU or the each member countries itself, and then also the potential of joining the CPTPP. But actually, I don't know there any strong demand for that. As far from my purely, the international trade policy perspective, and the CPTPP is written by the US, led by the US, and then it's the EU's FTAs. I studied so many EU's FTAs, very, very different. And whether the EU can accept the international trade rules written by somebody or not is an issue more than the geopolitical issues. I don't think the EU can accept something written by others. Always, negotiating with the EU is always very, very difficult because the EU can never compromise, because the inside they had, all the member states, and then they can't compromise even the very, very little tiny things. It's always labeled in detail. And especially, let's say that CPTPP's e-commerce chapter, this is very much old and it needs to be updated. But this is the EU is human-centric data governance and data governance regime. The CPTPP takes market-driven regimes. Whether the EU can accept completely different approach or not. Purely from trade policy perspective, the EU can't accept it.
Thank you for that. Actually, I have a bit more of a, maybe it's more of a philosophical question, but we've seen a growing emphasis in recent years in a shift away from trade liberalization towards trade or supply chain resilience, as Wendy was alluding to. We've seen these newer initiatives like IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So does this reflect that CPTPP is a legacy of an earlier era? Is it outdated given the current increased growing emphasis on issues of protectionism or supply chain resilience? I see several questions have also been posed on whether the CPTPP will be able to address issues related to critical mineral supply chains and climate action. What are your thoughts on that? Perhaps Shihoko first, and then others. But
yeah, I think that's a really important point to make about the ideology shifts today. I would argue that when we look at CPTPP as a political tool, as a forum to bring like-minded countries together in a rules-based order, there is great value in bringing all countries to buy into the system that is, quite frankly, currently under jeopardy. But from a purely economic perspective, there is obviously a ranking of countries that are more valuable as partners than others, one. And then the other reality is that there are new priorities when it comes to protecting economic interests. And so the question then becomes, as Wendy said, is it worth the capital to encourage expansion, and to what extent, to what end is that? The other issue is, are there better forums to advance economic interests outside or inside as the CPTPP? Right now, there is a great deal of movement outside the TPP space. Again, because the United States is not part of the CPTPP and is not expected to join the CPTPP anytime soon. And I'm not a betting person, but I will bet you that when Prime Minister Kishida is in Washington in April, he will, as all of his predecessors have done, and as all of high-ranking Japanese government officials do when they visit Washington, he will make the pitch for the United States to join CPTPP, but that is just standard talk. So there is this importance as a political tool of CPTPP, but when it comes to ensuring that the bigger advanced economies are cooperating on issues of strategic interest for them, then we will see greater coordination on specific issues-led concerns. And they are, of course, about supply chain resiliency. We're going to have a lot of discussions about export controls and the scope of the controls actually being implemented. We're going to also be talking a great deal about foreign investments coming into respective countries, in the case of the United States, from Japan and vice versa. So these are traditional and non-traditional trade concerns that have appeared, but it will not necessarily take place in a multilateral forum. The bigger isn't necessarily better, and it's certainly not an efficient approach.
So I would add that if you look at trade agreements, over time, they've been pretty flexible in terms of introducing new issues that are affecting the global economy. So whether it be, adding labor in the environment, or adding, in the Uruguay round, adding IPR and services, or, during TPP, adding state-owned enterprises. So I suspect that during the comprehensive review by CPTPP members of the agreement, they're going to be under pressure to make the agreement more relevant with the issues of the day that are confronting the trading system. Now, I'm not saying all these economic security issues, fit comfortably under an agreement like CPTPP, particularly when it comes to export controls, where I see that kind of as a separate kind of issue. But supply chain resiliency has so much to do with trade. And frankly, early on in the TPP negotiations, many years ago, we were in the United States contemplating putting forward an idea of having a supply chain chapter. Even at that time, the idea being that we needed a more kind of comprehensive view towards how trade was really being conducted in the region. So I think the review is, although it's a review of current provisions, I'm sure the review will also hit upon what new issues need to be added. And for CPTPP's credibility and viability, I hope that the members would look at these issues under the economic security agenda, as well as ways to really strengthen the environment, the chapter with respect to environment, strengthen the agreement with respect to inclusivity and dealing with income inequality. There's just a whole host of issues that I think they'll need to take on. And for me, what's going to be interesting to watch is that as this review is conducted, will the other accessions kind of be put on hold, because the CPTP members are they don't know what to do with these 6 applications. Do they then put their resources more into the review and kind of, slowly keep talking to those 6 economies that have applied, but not making any decisions on, who's next?
Thank you for that, Wendy and Shihoko. Minako, I just wanted to come back to you on the issue of the UK's accession to the CPTPP. I mean, as I mentioned, 2 countries have already ratified, Singapore most recently. What do you see to be the main sources of resistance to potential ratification for the UK? I mean, I was reading an article that the meat industry in Canada is calling on the government not to ratify the agreement, given concerns about UK pork entering or increasing UK pork entering the Canadian market and not having reciprocal access. So what do you see them as the main barriers to ratification for the UK?
I don't think I'm the right person to answer for this. There is, as you may know, all of you know, the UK's Canada's continuity agreement of the updating the agreement of the negotiation was stopped, and then that reason is the UK registered to open this beef, hormone beef from Canada. And then I must say, this is the trade policies always the diplomacy, economic diplomacy in the international levels, always strongly linked with domestic issues. And then as the domestic trade agreement become very deep, much more than non-tariff, and then completely directly relates to the domestic regulations, this is always an issue of a conflict. And then the UK, even though now the outside of the EU, the legally and then culturally, historically, very much, especially the general public, is very much European-minded. That means very much sensitive with what the American consumer can exist and Canadian consumer can accept. The UK consumers has very strong notion of the precautionary principle. And this is something that whether Canada does not want it and they want to push it, but then the UK try to respond to the societal concerns, and it can't compromise. So whether try to make the market access or try to protect the consumers' concerns, and then how to respond, the Canada respond to it is, I think I really can't answer to that, but it must be really I think the potential problem. And then I'm sorry, one thing I'd like to come back to economic security issues, if I may. It's okay, very brief. I think, well, that I completely agree. Environment and security is the issue of the CPTPP update to the current status. And then, but there are two issues I want to concern. One is the the rise in protectionism and then changing norms of free and open trade is a big challenge of today's world trade. And then actually CPTP members themselves are shifting toward managed trade. Is it because it's now that we need it, the securitization of everything we say, securitization of trade. Is it the right direction or not? Is something we have to think. How is a key. Fine, economic security, that's addressing the economic security is fine. Should be the copy of IPEF, or what will be the scope? And then can we introduce inward screening, for example, or inward investment screening? And then how that scope will be, and then what will be the base of this, the norm will be, and then completely change the shape of the CPTPP. So that to welcome that U.S. potentially rejoining the CPTPP, should the CPTPP members have to reshape the CPTPP for the U.S. preference or not? That will be a very big discussion, and I'm very much concerned about the CPTPP become the more, the shifting toward the securitization of trade.
Thank you for that, Minako. I'm conscious of the time, but I would perhaps like to squeeze in two more questions if I can. One, there's an interesting question that's come in here, and maybe for you, Wendy, is if something like the USMCA is foreseeable for the Asia-Pacific. So not a major multi-party agreement, but with just one or two partners. So for instance, the US with Japan and South Korea, could you foresee something of that sort manifesting?
So there has been a lot of discussion about whether USMCA, given the unprecedented bipartisan congressional support for it, could be like a model for future agreements that the U.S. could participate in the Indo-Pacific. It's an interesting question. I would just highlight a few challenges. Number one, currently there are no accession provisions in the USMCA. This was not a mistake. This was deliberate. And I think it was driven by the view that what we wanted to see when the Trump administration negotiated this with congressional approval, they wanted to see more and more production in North America and in the United States in particular. And once you add in other countries, by definition, you're diluting the rules of origin and diluting North American production. So I just throw that out there as, kind of two related issues that present challenges. I think what might be more likely is, instead of accessions to the USMCA, that model is reviewed and adjusted, because that's, in many ways, that represents where U.S. trade policy is much better than where the CPTPP is. But I would also argue, like USMCA, for example, has kind of a TPP plus digital chapter, one right now that I don't think the U.S. would sign again if that were part of the agreement. So these agreements and issues are evolving over time. But I would just conclude and just say the USMCA could be a model. Maybe the U.S. chooses to build on IPEF as a way to kind of increase its economic engagement in the region. There are various different approaches that could be taken if we had the political will and economic interest to do so.
Thank you for that, Wendy. I'm conscious of the time, but I have one last question that I would like to ask. And that's because given that I cover India, I wanted to bring this up. So one of the potential beneficiaries of this push to try and de-risk or diversify supply chains away from China is India. And yet India is neither a member of the CPTPP nor the RCEP, the Regional Conference of Economic Partnership. So my question to any or all of you is where do outsiders like India fit into the, sort of the emerging economic architecture in the Indo-Pacific? Perhaps Shihoko, if you have any.
Yeah, just very briefly.
Quick thoughts, yes. Thank you.
It is not from the lack of trying to woo India on the part of economies, right? So India is not part of RCEP, but it was India's decision. India did not sign on to the now not moving digital chapter of the digital pillar of IPEF.
The trade pillar, yeah.
I'm sorry, the trade pillar. of IPEF. There is courting of India in so many respects, but I believe that this becomes a domestic issue for the Modi government to try to ensure that there is domestic resilience. At the same time, for India to be a greater integral part of the economic system, especially when it comes to enhancing its standing in the global supply chain as well. So it's India's call.
Yes, very much so. So I think we will. On that note, we will need to call this event to a close. As mentioned, this forms part of a series of events that we're holding in partnership with Japan House London. Our next event will actually be taking place next month on the 18th of March, which will be an in-person event at Japan House, looking at the role of the G7 in the global South. So please keep a lookout for the invitation for that event. And if you are interested in the work we're doing on Asia, please keep a look at keep your eyes on the Chatham House website or sign up for the Asia Pacific Program newsletter. And on that note, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to our excellent speakers.